Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have a fellow flutist with me today. Elsa, welcome to Off the Podium.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
It's been a long time and you're probably the first guest that I've actually met in person because most of my guests on this podcast have been people from around the world and I've never met any of them except you, and it's been probably 10 or 12 years at this point since we've seen each other. But
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and it's your career has taken off and you're doing amazing things that I absolutely love. Let's start with the first thing that comes to mind, which is the CD release, the tour. You had a US tour, I think, and then you had a European tour that just recently ended. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the US tour was mostly East Coast, or it was all East Coast. And it was really fun. It was really an interesting mix of venues. But the band that I had on that tour was my band, so it was the band that was on the record. And those guys are just really fun to play with at this point. We've been playing together consistently for 3 years, which means that if I musically run off a cliff, they run with me. And like we always land together. We always figure out how to get out of whatever situations we get into musically. And it's a really, really fun band to work with. Because we're also all friends, so it's just like a continuation of our relationships as friends onto the stage as musicians, and we just keep improvising musically rather than with conversation in life.
Yeah. And so the European tour, you were back in the homeland, from what I understand.
The European tour was actually with a different band.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So we did do some of the songs from the album for that tour, but it was a completely different thing. It was a collective where everyone in the group writes for the group.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's awesome. Yeah. I was going to ask about the move to the US from Sweden and the reason for it and the outcome, which is great, and you've made a successful career now. Why did you move to the US?
Well, I mean, we're all kind of impulsive when we're 18, right? I actually moved to Seattle for a guy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we broke up 3 days later.
Wow.
But when I was there, I was like, I might as well apply for school, so I applied to Cornish and got in, so I stayed. And I had a return ticket, I just never went home.
Wow.
And it worked out. You know, I loved living in Seattle. I loved the music I was able to create there.
Yeah.
And a big part of it, I mean, I say I moved there for the guy. He was a great excuse. I knew it wasn't going to work out. I think he knew that too. Like, yeah. When I moved over there, I actually wanted to move to South Africa because I was super obsessed with South African music.
I see.
And my mom was like, "You're 18 and from Sweden. Maybe move somewhere else first." She didn't say no, which was smart, because if she would have said no, I would have gone.
Yeah. When I read about you, I don't think I saw the word jazz to describe you. I mean, I know you play in different styles, but how would you describe your genre that you play? Would it be jazz?
That is a really hard question. I mean, yes, it's modern jazz, technically. And it's definitely rooted in jazz. A lot of the aesthetics are jazz aesthetics. But it's not traditional. You're not going to find a 2/5 chord progression. You're not going to find any of the things that are codified in the jazz language or the jazz school. It's very inspired by world music, but taken through the lens of modern jazz. So the harmony is very modal. There is no key center. I don't use key signatures when I write because it's not relevant.
You know, growing up as a flutist, or most of the instruments that you see in an orchestra, most kids playing the instruments don't end up thinking about eventually pursuing a career outside of classical music, I guess. Right. So how did you come about playing music of different genres other than classical?
I've never been very good at being told what to do. I think that's what started it. And I also, growing up in Sweden, I played a lot of Swedish folk music that does have an improvised component to it. And I really loved that freedom and the thing of being able to express what I felt in that moment rather than having to fit my expression into someone else's vision.
Yeah.
Or my vision from another day, but having to actually respond to where I was at in that moment musically.
Yeah.
And then also, the reason I picked up flute, actually, was because I used to play classical piano, and I loved it, and I was addicted to practicing.
Yeah.
But then in the summer, we would go to California, and there was no piano.
Oh.
So I would have 2 months of just being incredibly frustrated that I couldn't play.
Yeah.
And, I would go to, like, churches, and I would seek out these places that had a piano and play until they kicked me out.
Yeah.
But that's why I started picking up the flute, because I could always take it with me, and I could take it backpacking, and I could take it, like, out in nature. And that's also part of why I began improvising, was being out in backcountry in California, 3-day hike from the closest road, and just playing.
Yeah.
Where no one can hear you, and it doesn't matter what you play.
Yeah.
But that freedom really spoke to me and I'm still searching for that in everything that I find, and I find that in classical music sometimes too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where just you find that sense of freedom in the music.
Yeah. And improvising, it's like composing on the spot with no eraser.
Absolutely.
How do you approach it, and do you go back listening to some of your live recordings and maybe learn from those experiences and say, maybe I should have done this rhythmically or melodically here, and I didn't do so well, I could have done this better? How do you approach that?
I record pretty much every live gig I do with my band. I record most rehearsals too.
Wow.
And I will listen to them, and it's not so much technically, it's more just expression-wise. Like,
I see.
Because when I listen back to it, I remember what I was thinking, I remember what I was feeling and what I was going for, and it's more an analysis of what was effective and what wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, where was I able to communicate what I actually meant, and if I wasn't, what do I need to change about my playing or about myself in order to be able to do that?
Yeah.
And some of it is absolutely technical. I'll listen back to be like, oh gosh, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And then I'll figure out what I actually meant instead, and I will practice that, and then next time I want to have that sound or that effect, I will have it ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's not so much the approach to improvising, it's not so much plug and play. I'm not sitting there thinking, oh, it'd be cool here if I played 7/5. That'd be super cool here. I'm not thinking about that in the moment.
Yeah.
But if it happens and I like it, I figure out what it is so that I can use it as a color.
Yeah. What do you say to people who are inspired by people like you who improvise, but say we can't improvise? Is it something that comes naturally, or is it something that could also be learned, or is it a bit of both maybe?
It can absolutely be learned. What I would say was, you improvise every day. Mm-hmm. Like, everybody improvises every day. We're improvising right now. This is a conversation. That's an improvisation.
Yeah.
It's really the thing of the musical fear of improvisation is the fear of making a mistake.
Yeah.
And the fear of not having a structure.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, if no one tells you what to do, then how can you know if you're right?
Yeah.
But that's the conversation. It's a conversation. What's relevant is what you're expressing.
Yeah.
And just try it. Like, actually, that's part of my practice routine. And it has been for years, where I'll do my, like, long tone warm-ups, I'll do my scales, and I'll put a timer on for 15 minutes and improvise.
Yeah.
And I have to play until the 15 minutes are up. And it's just an exercise in, no matter what I play, it's fine.
Yeah.
If it sucks, it's fine. Because improvising, it takes time, and it takes learning. It takes not having a translation period between your mind and your fingers.
Yeah.
And that's scary when you're used to going the other way.
Yeah.
But it really, there are all these barriers that we put up against the idea of improvising with instruments when you're coming from the classical world. Because I started with classical.
Yeah.
And you build these barriers against it and make it seem like a bigger hurdle than it really is.
Yeah. It's crazy because back, a couple of hundred years ago, classical musicians, if you take some of the concertos and the cadenzas, they did improvise, and then somehow it fell out of fashion. And it's crazy that so many classical musicians nowadays have such a big fear, and they wouldn't even want to take on that cadenza and bring it to life with their own approach. It's unfortunate, but hopefully that's something that will eventually change. I was going to ask you about flute, and I know there's a lot of great jazz flute players out there, and some of them were your mentors, because I get this from some kids that play in some of my youth orchestras who also play in a jazz band. They say, I'm a flute player and I want to play in the jazz band, but my instructor says you also have to do sax. You have to double on it. So how has that been? Has that been a problem for you? And do you double on sax or something else?
I don't double. And that has been a very conscious choice. Just because, as you know, like playing saxophone does affect your flute embouchure.
Yeah.
Kind of a lot.
Yeah.
And I made a choice that I would rather be good at what I'm passionate about and let people who are passionate about saxophone play saxophone.
Yeah.
Now, what that's meant for me is absolutely, I don't play in big bands. I don't play the gigs that are required that you double.
Yeah.
And if I did double, I would play those gigs.
Yeah.
It's not, and then that's a very real choice that I made, knowing that I was basically saying no to a whole bunch of gigs.
Yeah, that's right.
That I could have had. But I've never regretted that choice, because in terms of what I want to do with my instrument and for my instrument, flute gets put in this box so much. And it can be so much more than that. It has a place in those ensembles too. It has a place in any style of music. I mean, people say flute's too soft. We have microphones. It's not.
Yeah.
You can put a distortion pedal on it, and you can play it in metal bands. I mean,
yeah.
It's not this dainty little thing. It's not only a dainty thing.
Yeah.
It can be anything.
And there's a lot of examples of that. Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson
Yes.
from Jethro Tull played in a rock band, and we also have a lot of jazz flute players. How was it to study with Robert Dick? Tell me about that experience. Or, he's a mentor and maybe someone you learned from. How was that experience?
I mean, Robert's absolutely amazing. I studied with him for a year, and then now I have a flute quartet with him, so we're collaborating on that, and it's mostly improvised. It's so interesting because my approach to music and his approach to music is very different, and he's used to teaching people who want to learn his approach.
Yeah.
And I don't really. I want to learn from him, and I want to learn, sure, his approach in a way, but I'm not looking to be the next him.
Yeah.
So studying with him, we both had a lot of fun, because I would bring these things in and be like, how would you approach this? And it would be more of a conversation. And then also, of course, I mean, technically he is far beyond what I'm ever going to be able to be.
Come on.
And using extended techniques in the jazz idiom and figuring out how to apply his way of thinking outside the box for the flute that was the most inspirational thing for me studying with him, was thinking of flute as an instrument that really can be anything.
Yeah. And
even without effects, because I use effects from time to time, but you can get distorted sounds, you can get really rough sounds out of a flute. And I learned a lot of that from Robert, and a lot of that mentality of don't put yourself in this box, experiment, see what you can find, see what you can learn about the instrument from the instrument.
Yeah. So you studied with Robert, but before your studies with him, you primarily studied with people whose primary instrument was not the flute. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
the other flute player I've studied with is Jamie Baum. She's a jazz. And
yeah.
You know her.
Yeah.
I think we talked about her, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but studying with her was this is jazz.
Yeah.
This is how you improvise. This is how you find the lines through the chord changes.
Yeah.
Primarily, I've studied with drummers and bass players.
Wow. Which is actually great because there's a lot to learn from drummers and bass players, as a flute player especially.
my sense of time and my sense of rhythm coming from the classical world, that was the hardest thing, switching to jazz. Because it's such a different approach, and it's such a different way to think about and to relate to those things.
Yeah.
And that was really hard because no one could explain to me how to do that.
Yeah.
You know? So that's why I started studying with drummers and bass players, because that's their job, and I wanted to see how they related to it. And it's not something that you can really talk about in the lesson, like how to relate to time.
Yeah.
Especially if they're in this idiom and they're in this school where it just kind of happens naturally because you play that way.
Yeah.
And I'm coming from outside and I'm like, how do you do that? How do you make your quarter notes sound like they're that heavy and full and grounded? Yeah. And can I do that on a flute? Because of course you can do that on a drum. You just hit it and it's heavy.
Yeah.
So I've kind of through studying with drummers and bass players, I've developed this whole approach to working on time as a melodic instrument.
Yeah.
That is, it is very rooted in how drummers approach time.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps that I'm married to a drummer.
Oh, I see. Okay. I didn't know that. I knew your husband plays in one of the bands because I saw it somewhere, Facebook or one of these social media things, but I didn't know he was a drummer.
Yeah. Our house is full of drums.
I was going to ask about some inspirational people that have inspired you primarily for the flute, and this will be good for some of the listeners who have no idea that, of course, the jazz flute world or the improvised or non-classical flute world is not that big, but at the same time, it's there's quite a few players. So who are some people that have inspired you and you would recommend to people who don't know about them to listen to them?
That's a fun one. Well, absolutely Robert, but that's kind of in both worlds.
Yeah.
Hermeto Pascal is Brazilian composer. The stuff that he does for bass flute is, especially the completely improvised stuff, is just mind-blowingly beautiful. There's so many Brazilian people. If you want to get into chorinho, that's a whole school. There's Hadar Neuberg. She's fantastic. She's a New York-based flute player. I mean, there's Hubert Laws.
Yeah.
There's Herbie Mann. There's Yusuf Latif, who also plays saxophone. But is flute playing. I really love his phrasing on flute.
Yeah, I have a lot of his records too.
Yeah. You could go on. I don't know how many you want.
When I was classically trained, and when I wanted to listen to more music outside of classical music from flute players, I went to this record store and I was trying to find records and I couldn't. I didn't even know where to start. This is 15 years ago or so. The guy was like, "So what do you want to listen to? What should I recommend for you?" And I said, I want some jazz flute or something. So the two things he recommended were Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull, which is not jazz, but I understood where he's coming from, recommending that, and also Eric Dolphy.
Absolutely.
So those were like my start, and then I kind of went from there. And some of the names you recommended from the Brazilians, I actually don't know about, and I'll be honest about that, but I'll definitely check them out after our chat. But Herbie Mann and Hubert Laws I know, and Hubert Laws had a nice quote about you. I forget what it was, and I should probably pull it up now, but he had a nice quote about you. What's the relationship there?
I volunteered at a NEA Jazz Awards event in New York, and because I played flute, they basically assigned me to help Hubert with whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Which meant I got to sit in on rehearsals with him and just basically hang out with him for a weekend.
Wow.
And then after that, I sent him a CD and asked his opinion, and he had some nice things to say.
Yeah.
I think the exact quote was, "Who would have thought such an innocent face could encompass so much creativity?"
That's right. Now
and
it comes.
I cut most of it, so it just says so much creativity, which is technically what he said. Because the whole innocent face bit, that's not really relevant, is it?
Another question. This might be a little bit of a tricky one, maybe, but did mention a few women flute players, but it's a lot of men in this world. How does that feel to be in your position?
I mean, it gets better every year. It gets better with every generation.
Yeah.
But like we mentioned Jamie Baum, I didn't say her earlier either.
Yeah.
She's absolutely a fantastic musician, and she's a huge inspiration because I spent a lot of time with her, both studying with her, and we became friends. And for every generation of women who push through this shit, it gets better.
Yeah.
And for me, with the people that I work with and the people that I deal with musically, the musicians, it's never a problem.
Yeah.
The audience can be a problem. Mm-hmm. Reviewers can be a problem.
But come on, after they listen to you play, there's no way they should have a problem. After the first couple notes, they should know that you're just a rock star on there, and there should be no problem, right?
And I mean, hope so. Thank you. More for me, my approach to all of this is a lot of people don't know what to do with me. Like, they don't know how I want to be treated because I don't look like I would be this fierce thing. Like, I've been called a sleeper so many times.
Oh, come on.
Like a sleeper agent because they don't expect it.
Yeah.
And all I do is I'm very upfront with people. Like, when I meet a new musician or I'm working with them, I'm like, hey dude, this is how I like to be treated.
Yeah.
Treat me like I'm one of the dudes. If you buy me a drink, I'm going to buy you one back. If you hold the door for me when I'm carrying gear, I'm going to hold the door for you. Like, it's not... Treat me like I'm a person before I'm a woman. I'm a musician first.
Yeah.
I'm a human first.
Yeah.
And all these other things, they are kind of arbitrary.
Yeah.
And as long as I come at it from a place of being respectful, it's like, it's not like I'm going to be offended if someone holds the door for me, or I'm going to be offended about these things. It's more that I am respectfully saying how I like to be treated.
Yeah.
And everyone else is entitled to do the same with me. Like, if they don't want me to swear around them, I won't. Because I swear a lot.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome to do that. But I was going to ask you about another thing, which I found interesting. Was it that you're endorsed by Trevor James Flutes? Mm-hmm. How did that happen? And do they have any other non-classical people that they endorse?
They endorse pretty much exclusively jazz and world music people.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that. So that's...
They're a really cool company that way because they definitely think outside the box.
Yeah.
With the artists that they support and also with the instruments that they build. Mm-hmm. They do some cool stuff.
Yeah.
And our relationship, the way it is I play their instruments. They build me certain things, which is really great.
Yeah.
And I do master classes for them in London from time to time. And at conventions and stuff, I'll go. And it's mostly like I really respect their instruments. I really respect the work they do, both in terms of what they build and in terms of their ethics as a company. They do some really great stuff. Yeah.
I read that you do a couple of master classes. One is for doublers and one is, more jazz improvising on the flute master class.
Actually, the one is specifically for doublers. The other one that I really love to teach is actually my favorite one to teach is the rhythm one. Like how to approach rhythm as a melodic player. Yeah. And that one is super fun to teach because the first thing I do is I put the metronome on beat one of every 4 bars and ask everyone to clap when it comes. Mm-hmm. And it's like a shotgun. Like no one is on it after 4 bars. So it's this idea, the whole class is built around the idea of, it's actually a Thelonious Monk quote that just because you're not a drummer doesn't mean you don't have to keep time. Yeah. We're all responsible for the time. We're all responsible for the rhythm and how to work on that, how to improve that without doing it in relationship to someone else. Mm-hmm. How to improve your own internal sense of time and sense of rhythm. Yeah. So that class is fun. Also, anyone who studies with me gets that class.
Well, that's great. So I was going to ask you, you also have quite a few students that you teach privately, right?
Yeah. In Brooklyn, I've got about 20.
Wow. The classical background, I know how the lessons went in that sense, but studying with you might be a completely different experience, I'm assuming, and an approach. How do your lessons look like? Do you make your students improvise even when they don't want to?
No, of course not. I mean, they usually end up wanting to.
Yeah.
A lot of my students are very young, so
Yeah.
we're working on how to just like figure out the instrument.
Yeah. Yeah.
The older students, I always have them pick their own repertoire.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
And most of what lessons with me are, if you're an older student, is fear management.
Yeah.
For that thing that we talked about with like being afraid of improvising, because that's really the thing, is that's the only reason people ever cite for not wanting to improvise.
Yeah.
Is because they're scared to. And that fear translates into you're playing in classical music as well. Like, you're afraid of making a mistake, and that fear and that tension does come out in your playing.
Yeah.
And if you use improvisation as a mistake management technique instead of as a artistic statement, you can find ways to not be so tense and not be so worried about whether or not you're going to be able to play this section perfectly. If you mess up a note, finding your way back or finding a way to be comfortable with that. So it's a lot of that, lessons with me, and it's definitely a lot of the metronome is on and we're clapping.
Yeah. How does the life look like outside of music? Do you have time to do anything else?
What?
Do you do?
Is that a thing?
Do you have time to do anything else outside of music?
I mean, sometimes.
It's always interesting to me because musicians are so in music. It's always music, no matter what you're doing. If you're not practicing, then you're reading about something or listening to something or someone or a concert or fixing your website, doing all these different things. And there's never time for something else.
There is absolutely no work-life separation.
Yeah.
But that's part of the beauty of it, is that to me, music is life.
Yeah.
It both expresses life and it is life. And like composing for me, that's my diary.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit scary that I'm then taking that diary and just like throwing it out at the world. But it's also, there's something really beautiful about that, and I think the world really needs that, the thing of complete commitment to whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
And there's two sides of it, right? Where it's like, yes, music is everything all the time, but it's also important to make sure that you're enjoying your art form, like as a listener and as a participant, rather than just as an artist. And for me, that translates. Like, I will absolutely take full days off and not take my flute along and go out and go hiking.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't mean that that's not about music. Because I know that by doing that, when I get back home, I will be inspired to see my instrument again. Mm-hmm. And I will approach it differently because I took that time away from it.
Yeah.
And it all relates. Like, it's a holistic life thing where everything kind of connects.
Yeah. So composing, different people have different approach to composing. How does your process work? And I realize there's a lot of folk music, and as you mentioned too. But last night, my wife and I were listening to a bunch of your recordings, and she loved a lot of them, and we just kept listening. It was amazing. Oh. Folk music and incorporating these different things in what you're doing and kind of creating your own style. How does that work? What's the process?
There's a couple of different processes. I mean, one of the ways that it can happen for me is that I'm constantly researching folk music. Whenever I meet someone from any country that I don't know very much about, the first thing I ask is, what are your 3 favorite bands from home?
Yeah.
And I'll write them down and I'll check it out. And usually from that, I'll get inspired by something in some groove. Mm-hmm. And I'll write something based on that, or write something around that, or I'll hear that there's a Swedish melody that would work really well with that.
I see.
The whole concept with the way that I write when it's the folk music stuff is that there's always something similar. There's always something that's in common between all these different things, right? And the thing that started me on that is the Swedish melody that kept cropping up. Mm-hmm. Like, whenever I was researching a new tradition or like looking into some new music, I would find aspects of this melody, and it kept coming back everywhere. And to me, that was like, maybe this is a basic melody that just humans kind of connect to. Mm-hmm. And that's why it keeps coming up in all these different, very different, like not the same continent, mm-hmm. folk music. So what I'm trying to do with the folk music stuff is highlight the fact that underneath everything, I already talked about this a little bit, but underneath all of the distinctions, all of the differences, all of the definitions that we put on ourselves and on each other, there is commonality.
Yeah.
And if we think about that and we talk about that when we meet new people and when we meet new cultures and when we interact with the world, that's a much easier way to connect and a much easier way to see each other as human instead of as other.
Yeah.
So that's one of the approaches. That kind of took a left turn there, didn't it?
No, it's great.
Another thing that happens when I compose is, honestly, my piano is between my bed and the bathroom. And so I'll get up at like 3 a.m. and I'll hear something and I'll walk to like go to the bathroom and I'll get stuck at the piano. And 3 hours later, I'm like, oh shit. My neighbors hate me. No, they don't. They're fine with it. We've talked. It's all good. But it really is like my diary. Like there's always music in my mind floating around, and I just have to have the time and the space to sit down and write it down.
Yeah.
And the third way that things happen for me with composing is when I'm traveling, actually. I will hear a melody or I'll like have a vibe in mind and I'll just record it on my phone. And then I'll come home and I'll like piece it out and figure out what I actually meant and write it down from there.
I have two more questions that come to mind, and they're completely different from probably things that we talked about, but there's a long tradition in America with jazz and improvised music. There's also a tradition in Europe. How are they different now? Present, you interact with a lot of musicians from around the world and you've just done a tour. What would you say about the two different places in jazz?
Europe and US?
Europe and US, yeah, sure. I know it's a broad question, but...
That is a broad question. I mean, I think every scene has its own thing.
Yeah.
And because of internet and stuff, it's more a question of what scene you're in.
Yeah.
Like what type of jazz you play versus what continent you're on.
Yeah.
The thing with New York, the thing with being in New York and what I love about being here is that every scene exists here.
Yeah.
And you can kind of move through them fluidly.
Yeah.
And for me, there's two main branches of jazz, the way that I perceive it here.
Okay.
And there's the one where it's like the Wynton Marsalis branch, you know, where it's all like the real jazz was in the 50s.
Okay.
And anything after that is not really real jazz. And I mean, you
are those some
my
jabs?
Voice, but I kind of take offense to that concept.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I just think that anything that becomes dogmatized or anything that becomes so you have to fit in this box or you're not.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't agree with.
Yeah.
And especially with jazz that started out as a mix. It started out as this thing of all these different things coming together, creating this new style. And then on the other hand, you have the most forward-thinking, crazy nonsense.
Yeah.
In New York, and that isn't that at all. But that they can coexist and you can actually exist in both of those worlds and create music is really cool to me.
Yeah.
But both of those concepts and both of those approaches exist in Europe as well.
Yeah. It's funny because you say that about jazz, but I could say the same thing about classical music, and
right.
It's the same kind of battle. People who want to kind of have a forward-looking approach to what's happening in the world of classical music, and others who still want to program the same pieces and the same composers over and over again, not giving the new generations a chance to kind of have an opportunity. And last question, what advice or something that you would tell young musicians that are practicing music and want to be musicians, or maybe they don't want to be musicians but they're still practicing and playing an instrument? Any advice from your long career, or I should say short career, but will be long in 60, 70 years from now?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I have a thing. And it's kind of a simple thing, but all it is find what you love. Find what you love and learn that. because there's, in all these different schools and all these different traditions and all of these different things, there's always going to be someone who tells you this is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
There is no right way to do it. The only right way to play music is to play what you love and put your heart into it.
Yeah.
And whether you're a professional or not, like whatever level you're at, that is the point of music.
Yeah.
Is to love it.
And when you do that, when you have your approach and you have that sense and you want to approach music that way, or anything else, it doesn't even have to be music, it could be anything that you're doing. When you have that approach, it brings something unique to the world, you know, and it brings something new and refreshing, just like you're doing with your music, you know, incorporating all these different things and having your own style instead of just holding back and maybe following your teacher's footsteps, you know, doing what Robert Dick was doing, or saying, you know what, I really love Hubert Law, so I'm gonna do what he did, exactly what he did, because he was so successful. You know, having your approach and knowing that you could bring something unique it's always great, and it gives people who are listening to you something to get excited for.
Well, the only thing that makes you original is that you're you.
Yeah.
That's really the only thing.
Yeah. Well, Elsa, it's been great. I can't believe it's been 10, 12 years since I've seen you, and I think you were in Seattle at some point, and I think you're coming back, right, at some point for a concert?
I'm playing in Seattle on July 22nd.
If I'm in town, I'll definitely be there. I might be in LA though. I would love to see you again.
Yeah, we'll make it happen. And anytime you're in New York, hit me up.
Yeah, and maybe next time we'll have your husband be on this chat and we could all talk about it. Unless he'll create too much friction.
Nah, he's way too chill.
Well, that's great.
He went to Cornish.
Do I know him?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Well, I have to go back, and I don't know. I just didn't recognize the face watching some of the videos and. But
he graduated before us. But
okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's great to see you, you know, doing the things that you love doing and being so successful with it. Congrats on the release, on the tours, and everything else that's to come. And hopefully we'll do this again at some point.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.